Welcome, everyone. I'm Janet Salisbury, and I'm the founder of the Women's Climate Congress. I'd like to start by acknowledging that we're meeting on the lands of First Nations people. And I am here in Canberra, so it's the land of the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri people. But I know that many of you are coming from all around the country, because I've been very excited to see in the tribe booking on the map where you're all the different places that you're coming in from. And so I invite you to put in the chat your own acknowledgement for the country where you are. And I'd like to pay my deep respects to all of the elders, past, present, and emerging. And particularly in this year when we have a big conversation in Australia about First Nations self-determination, we have a strong desire to walk alongside them in that journey. It is great to see you all here for this Women's Climate Conversation online, which today is going to explore the theme, the old world and the new, women's leadership journeys in a changing climate. First, I invite you to take a moment to leave behind the busyness of your day and any rush you had to get here, and to sink fully into our purpose here together today. The Women's Climate Congress was started in 2020 after 35 Canberra women met in response to the Black Summer bushfires. Women could not stay silent when all around us was burning, but our party political discourse was in gridlock with little action for almost 2 decades, despite warnings from the International Panel on Climate Change. The biggest and most systematic and robust review of any scientific discipline that has ever been conducted was telling us that this was only the tip of the climate change iceberg without urgent action. Since then, with help from COVID and Zoom and a lot of hard work, we have grown into a movement of women all over the country, and we have many international connections as part of a global women's movement. My friend and teacher and co-founder of Canberra's A Chorus of Women, Dr Gabrielle Kuiper, has written that like constructive peacemakers in a time of war, we can think of building climate security as a process of nurturing life, bringing back the balance with nature that has been lost. Like weavers, we're connecting individual, diverse, maybe fragile, strings to make a new fabric that's useful, beautiful, and both flexible and very strong. Over the past 3.5 years, we've spoken with thousands of women, and from these conversations we have woven a Women's Charter for Change. It is a call to action from the hearts of women in all our diversity to urgently secure the climate and build ongoing human and planetary well-being. To this end, we urge collaboration and cooperation in governance to build inclusive, fair, and united policy approaches. I'm going to read the opening statements from the Charter, and I invite you to think of the tens of thousands of residents and tourists in Greece at this time who have been evacuated because of the terrifying wildfires and have lost homes and possessions and more. We women of the Women's Climate Congress and others despair that Earth is hurtling towards catastrophic climate change that humanity is failing to mitigate. We grieve the unfolding and potentially irreversible impacts on all current and future life, unless immediate and effective action is taken. The Charter has 11 themed areas for action. 3 are for immediate and urgent actions to secure the climate, and the other 8 are actions to promote ongoing human and planetary well-being. You can see the full Charter on our website at womensclimatecongress.com, and I urge you to go and look at it if you possibly can, if you haven't already seen it, and take a note not only of the words but of the visuals there, because in the Women's Climate Congress we believe in the value of the arts and the role of the arts to help us to connect to these big issues of our common humanity. For our conversation today, I'm going to hand over to Cheryl Durrant and her 2 guests to explore Action 1, Embrace Gender Balanced Inclusive Governance. This is the first of our 3 immediate and urgent actions to secure the climate and lies at the heart of all we do as a women's movement. I first met Cheryl when she was one of our conversationalists at one of these online events last year. She subsequently attended our 2-day National Congress of Women event in Canberra last September, where she moderated a panel discussion with women politicians from across the political spectrum. And we were delighted at the end of last year when she decided to join our Steering Circle, which is our board. In her professional life, Cheryl has over 30 years' experience in the national security sector, including specialist army intelligence and defence capability and preparedness roles. She's led the Defence Department initiatives on global change and energy sustainability and served on many other national and international committees and working groups. She's also a councillor with the Climate Council. Over to you, Cheryl.
Halfway through to deal with a backroom coup, so not the most auspicious circumstances. And Gabrielle now sits on a number of both international and national climate and energy advisory organisations, and also has experience with New South Wales government. Joining us as well is Willow Berzin, who many of you will know from her role as the Chief Assembler of the Coalition of Everyone, which I think is just a fabulous title. And she's also does some fabulous work with Regen Melbourne. I really have been following her on LinkedIn, so she must be the poster I see most often in my posts. I'm looking forward to hear Willow, who I've only just met recently this afternoon. Oh, I've been hearing her this evening. I've met her obviously before this afternoon. So the format today is there'll be some questions from me, and then hopefully at the end some questions from the floor. So if you do have some questions as we go through, please place them into the chat. But my first question to both Willow and Gabrielle, and I might kick off with Willow, is what does gender inclusive governance actually mean to you, and how can it be enabled? So Willow, over to you.
Thanks, Cheryl. And yeah, just lovely to be with you all here tonight. I feel very humbled and honoured to share a platform and come together, you know, in the context of now in this time as well, and share some space with you all. I would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people on whose land I'm situated, and their elders past and present as well. Look, I think that question, I've been thinking about it since Cheryl reached out, what it means to me. And I think that there's something about where we are now and where we could be as humans in our full capacity, having agency in the world and being the best of who we can be. And I think of gender inclusivity as being wanting to work with what is the sacred feminine and the sacred masculine, and probably the sacred neutral, non-gendered roles that we all play different aspects of. And really it just comes down to balance, I think. When we're unbalanced, look what happens. It's not really working for anybody particularly well, maybe just a few people. So when I think about that question, I think about how do we have balance in the roles we're playing, in leadership, in community, in business, and how do we sort of observe and ensure that we're not accidentally repeating old patterns. I mean, as a slightly reluctant female leader coming to leadership, okay, with my heels dug in, going, oh, I think I'm going to have to do this. This idea emerged to create a coalition of everyone about 5 years ago, and I definitely wasn't wanting to be on a platform. My preferred place as a designer is actually backstage and designing the program, let's say, with other actors on the stage. So around me and the work we've been doing, it's just trying to be conscious of having balance in our decision making and our outreach, and when we're working closely with others as well in community and with organizations. And I think part of that looking for balance as well is I'm curious about stretching inclusive governance even more broadly. And so part of the work we've been doing with the Coalition of Everyone is actually how do we work with communities and organizations and cross sectors with nature, and to listen deeply with nature, with what nature is actually trying to tell us in our governance, so that we can reconnect to nature, that we are nature, but also to future generations and to become better ancestors. So I sort of think of part of the journey of helping Coalition of Everyone emerge has been really trying to understand who is everyone when we're wanting to build this coalition for regeneration and the regeneration of the places that we live in together. And how do we actually work with all of our different diverse participants? And that's my cat meowing, excuse me.
Thanks, Willow. I just love that emphasis on balance rather than one side or another. It's really both coming together in harmony, another word that Janet likes, rather than just hearing a single note. So just throwing to you now, Gabrielle, your thoughts on what is gender inclusive governance?
Thanks, Cheryl, and I'll echo Willow in saying it's fantastic to be here with this amazing group of women. I'm dialing in from Gadigal country in Redfern, Sydney. And to pick up on that idea of balance, for me, it's important to have inclusive governance in a whole range of dimensions, and that includes cultural background, age, and particularly socioeconomic background, as well as gender. Australians are pretty reluctant to talk about class, but I sometimes sit in climate meetings wondering how many people grew up working class. I'd be surprised if there's more than one or two people on the Zoom who haven't been to university. I think, unfortunately, climate has long been a very middle class issue. And I think there are good reasons behind that, but I think that in all of our governance on climate and everything else, we need to make sure that we've got a wide diversity of backgrounds that can inform the decisions that are being made. And I also think it's really a matter of privilege, because governance tends to be done by those coming from positions of privilege. And I've certainly seen that. I think that has changed a lot. If I look at women in my 30s, particularly those who are in positions of leadership, including on climate, a number of them went to very expensive private schools, and they certainly grew up with the view that they, that they could do anything, which is fantastic. And it's very wonderful that they had that level of confidence, which I think is different to my mother's generation. But I think that just shows how things have changed on gender, and I think they've changed less in other regards. A classic example, obviously, with my Labor Party background, is the fact that the ALP set affirmative action targets in 1994. I had to look it up. And we've now got a federal parliament that's 53% women from the Australian Labor Party. And I noticed that the Labor Party is now looking potentially at cultural and Indigenous quotas. And I think that shows to what extent you need to have specific efforts put in place in all sorts of forms to get the diverse outcomes. As I said, governance is generally by the privileged for the privileged, and unless you put mechanisms in place, then that won't change. And on gender, it's not just a matter of women's governance, but I'm sure lots of people here are familiar with Emily's List, which not only supports female candidates, but they have to be pro-choice and pro-affirmative action. We were talking earlier about Margaret Thatcher, fantastic female leader on climate, wouldn't have agreed with everything else she did. But I think that shows the importance of taking into account a range of different dimensions other than just gender. It's about, does the person have an inclusive approach to the governance, and then does the governance as a whole have enough representation from people from different perspectives to be able to make sensible decisions on behalf of the whole community or whatever the organisation it is. So the final thing I did want to say that I think is really important for where we're at politically in terms of gender inclusive governance is that if you hadn't read the analysis, professional women are now the largest voting bloc in the Australian electorate. And that's a big change from that previously basically being men of trade qualifications. And that is why, but in particular, we now have 7 community independents who are all female in the lower house and 1 senator who's community independent in the upper house. Numbers matter, and I think that's always important to remember, and that those the women that we've got in now, I would say all come from positions of privilege, and maybe the next step is to make sure that we get greater diversity of women and people from all backgrounds into our parliament.
Thanks, Gabrielle. Just like to follow up with Willow, particularly intrigued by your "who is everyone" comment, because one of the regular practices I have in a number of meetings is to ask who's missing. And I know some groups regularly have a chair now for those who are not in the room, so that different voices are included. And I also just love the title, the Chief Assembler, and I think we really need to remake some new roles and some new titles to describe what we need to do. But can you tell us a little bit more about the role of the Chief Assembler?
Yeah.
How does this feel or look in practice?
Yeah, actually, I just really wanted to add one more thing, just riffing off Gabrielle. I think I missed something, and that is around inclusive governance. I think the approaches we can have also is our community-led collaborative governance approaches. And when we are then reaching out to more representative demographics to make decisions together, that can be where we can hopefully change things for the better. So I think there's like a and I just wanted to add to that before we moved on. But yeah, look, the Chief Assembler, I think when we started the Coalition of Everyone, the idea emerged about 5 years ago, and really I came to it through how do we basically try and help activate people's assemblies and citizens' assemblies and visioning assemblies everywhere, from the bottom up with the top down, for change from the middle out, to be able to help us make better decisions together. And that is still part of what we're about, but we've sort of, in time, all adapting and shifting contexts as our reality shifts as well, to really be working for regeneration, for healing and regeneration of places. And so the title, I suppose, comes from helping assemble teams and events, really. I think maybe a CEO is a helpful role, but I don't feel particularly drawn to it. I don't want to play that role, but it's kind of that role, but it's trying to help assemble work and outcomes and teams of people to be able to do it. And probably in my previous sort of career / old economy work, as a designer, and it's still the same now, I love great ideas and I love bringing teams of people together to help realize them and help manifest them and bring them into the world. So it's sort of still about that. It's just a name as well, but assembler works well with holding assemblies as another way to think about that kind of framing or architecture. And yeah, I think to the sort of second part of the question around how this is hopefully helping us shift our ways of seeing and being and doing together in the language we use, from there to how we hold space together and how we practice deep listening and how we can help design events in different ways to intervene in the system in different ways. In practice, it's been a really interesting journey for me as a human. I've had to do a lot of unlearning and a lot of relearning, a lot of wanting to understand, a kind of a curiosity of like, why is everything as bad as it is? And these are just symptoms of things underneath. And what are those things underneath? And what is beneath that? And what is beneath that and beneath that? And trying to learn how to think in systems. And it's an ongoing practice as well. And of course, part of that, and I was reminded of it this morning with the latest news that's coming in about the climate, is really trying to walk eyes wide open into our fears, and to be with that and to hold that and still be able to move with action, to kind of move towards active hope and to practice active hope, to be able to hold the complexity of, on the one hand, grief and despair and fear and paralysis, and hope and action, and that we can do things because we have the tools at hand. And how to hold both together is an ongoing practice. I think we're all here, we're all showing up. This is part of it. It's like, how do we find our roles in this? How do we be useful? How do we be of service to this time? Why are we alive, right? It's like, how is there 8 billion people alive on the planet right now? And how is it that we're more connected than we've ever been via Zoom through the accidental glitch of the pandemic giving us this weird, freaky gift so we can actually talk together like this in these ways? Like, this is amazing. We can do this. I really believe it. So I kind of feel very much like we need to have our eyes wide open, that we are as much a part of the system and culpable of the crimes of modernity as anybody else. I still love shoes. You know, it's like, that's not going away, but I want to be able to be useful, and I want to be able to serve, and I will do whatever I can within my spheres of influence, and often reaching outside of those into uncomfortable territory, such as having to overcome the fear of public speaking and being here with you tonight. Like, what can I do? What's mine to do? And how can I help? And I think this is what this is. It's like we're all here looking for that question, and it's coming back to that. And then also other practices like I've come across this word recently called ancillary design, which is around designing with and for emergence. So we're working in a really complex system. We're all a part of it, and we don't know necessarily the outcomes of what will happen. There is a lot of uncertainty, but we can still help design. Well, this is sort of the role I see myself being drawn towards, to help design pathways through that, even if we don't know the answer, and kind of leaning into that unknown as well. So what does it feel like? Sometimes it's terrifying, and sometimes I'm in tears, and other times I feel so much hope, and I feel hope with other people more than anything. And, you know, moving at the speed of trust and building trust with people in relationships, and realizing that we're all here to answer this call, to come together and figure our way through this, no matter what. Is it hopefully a short answer?
Well, thanks, Willow. It's a great answer. I'm feeling your energy and hope even through the screen today over Zoom, which is some weird thing that I'm noticing in Zoom. This is sort of this energetic transfer that shouldn't actually happen, but does, and when we're on the same wavelength. So a question that came up, or comment in the chat, was this new ways of doing things are so wonderfully refreshing and encouraging, but we still have to work with dominant existing power structures. And so I know Gabrielle has spent a lot of her life working in those power structures, or with those power structures, and has thought deeply about power. She sent me some chapters of a book which she's working on power, so the subject she's been reflecting on quite deeply. And I'm going to ask her a big question. One of the ones we always struggle with is, what new ways of embodying power are needed now, and how can emerging leaders engage with existing power structures?
Thanks, Cheryl. It is a huge question, and there are lots of stories I could tell, but I thought that one that might be useful, and in case people didn't know it, is the story of human domestication. So I don't know if you know, but humans obviously domesticated the cats, including the one that's popping around and having its tail in my Zoom occasionally. But what you might not know is humans have, by definition, self-domesticated. How do we know that? One of the key comparisons is the level of aggression and friendliness. So if you compare humans with chimpanzees, you could not put a group of chimpanzees on a 747 in a tightly confined space. They would tear each other limb from limb. Whereas despite the fact that we have, road rage and all the rest, we generally manage to live together relatively harmoniously in terms of we don't react and kill each other spontaneously a lot. And there's a anthropologist, Richard Wrangham, who was at Harvard, and he was like, how did this happen? And there's lots of different possible explanations, but the one that he's proposed, which at first I was like, really? But he looked at what you've obviously got to do is take people that are highly reactive out of the community so that they cannot breed. And that is the way that through evolutionary selection, just the same way that we selected friendlier wolves that became dogs, and likewise, cats. Here he is on cue. And so Richard Wrangham's thesis is that you had coalitions of men primarily that were quite egalitarian within themselves. But if there was a man in particular that was reactively aggressive, completely out of bounds, rape, murder, whatever you like, that the cabal of men would get together and organise for that person's execution. And you kind of think, well, that's a pretty extreme hypothesis. But if you look at basically all existing Indigenous, and what we know from past Indigenous cultures is they had a form of, execution often carried out by relatives of that person in the community. And obviously this could be misused and all the rest. But his theory is that it was through male cabals that were egalitarian within themselves that could take out the highly reactively aggressive men that we got overall human biology that's a lot less reactively aggressive. There's a price to be paid for that though, because we got much better at planning to take those raping and murdering guys out, and we got much better at proactive aggression, which gives you an explanation for genocides of all kinds, for example. Why do I think that's important is that it would suggest that the dominant form of power structure that we've had, throughout human history has really been these male cabals, and that's also been part of the domination of women and the nature of patriarchy. I'm going to segue, maybe a bit of a long boat, but I want to talk about what does that mean for where we are in the climate. And I would say that we now have cabals that are facilitating the destruction of the planet, and they're fossil fuel companies. They're not all controlled by men. In fact, there's a female CEO of one of the largest ones in Australia. But it's global fossil fuel companies, oil, gas and coal, and also, unfortunately, the despotic nation states that are major oil and gas producers. You will also note that those countries tend to be ones that are highly patriarchal. If you look at particular states in the Middle East and Russia and the like, women generally don't have a say there. So you could do some analysis on that. But I wanted to say their proactive aggression is superb. They're still planning major expansions of oil and gas fields in particular. Their propaganda is excellent, and their capture of more or less democratic governments is phenomenal. So Cheryl's question was kind of basically, what about new forms of power? And I'd say, well, so how do we undermine these kind of cabals that are destroying the biosphere? And one of the most useful things I heard recently is, what do fossil fuel companies hate more than anyone else? Who is their ultimate enemy? Like, who are they more scared of than anyone else? Women trying to protect their children. Like, that is the ultimate threat from their point of view, because obviously all the moral authority, not to mention potentially some maternal aggression and other very useful capabilities are there. So I think this is a matter of activism, of social movements. I don't actually think it's necessarily new ways of embodying power. I think it's like the last 200 years of social change. It's like first wave feminism. It's people putting their bodies on the line. It's people getting elected. It's comms. It's the legal actions. It's politics. It's campaigning on all levels, whether it's emotional, cognitive, creative resistance. And it needs to be as much as possible because we are at the end of days. In terms of engaging with existing power structures, I think the community independence are vitally important, but that doesn't mean that we should stop engaging with the existing political parties, because I think they're still really important. And I also think there's a whole scope for creative resistance in the corporate world. So there's major disruption needed there. ACCR, Australian Centre for Corporate Responsibility, is doing some fantastic work. There's Market Forces, another NGO doing major shareholder activism and also strategic litigation. Encourage you to donate as much as you can to organisations like that that are trying to be very effective corporately. So it was quite a ramble. I might pause there, and I'm hoping there'll be some questions on the back of that rant.
So please, if you have any questions, put them in the chat. But I have a question for you both while people formulate their questions. And well, I see some positive comments coming in, Gabrielle. And it's really, is there a woman's way of leadership? And if so, what does it look like? And I might stay with you, Gabrielle, on this one, as you're on a roll there. And for you, is there a woman's way of leadership?
Sorry, I was just trying to respond to the questions at the same time. I have no idea if there's a woman's way of leadership, I'm afraid, because, you know, we've talked about Margaret Thatcher already. I think for me, there's leadership that comes with an awareness of the position of privilege that leadership responsibility involves. And then there's leadership where people are blind to their responsibility to the broader community. And I know that I think what's the most important, because it's very easy in a position of privilege and in particular leadership positions to become blinded by the nature of, you know, the acquisitions that you get from other people and the like in positions of leadership. So I think always retaining empathy, which I don't think women have a monopoly on, but there's some interesting dynamics there around, around oxytocin. That's another whole story. But empathy is important, but not without strategy. And one of my absolutely favorite quotes, which I'm going to read in full, it's quite long, but one of my favorite quotes that I've found for the book comes from Martin Luther King. And he said, what happened is some of our philosophers got off base. And one of the great problems of history is that the concepts of love and power have usually been contrasted as opposites, polar opposites, so that love is identified with a resignation of power and power with a denial of love. It was this misinterpretation that caused Nietzsche, who was a philosopher of the will to power, to reject the Christian concept of love. It was the same misinterpretation which induced Christian theologians to reject the Nietzschean philosophy of the will to power in the name of the Christian idea of love. And he says, now we've got to get this thing right. What is needed is a realization that power without love is reckless and abusive, and love without power is sentimental and anemic. Power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice, and justice at its best is love correcting everything that stands against love. I can't say it any better than that.
No, it's fabulous. I've often sort of wondered at the concept of how do we balance the sort of need to be really compassionate, but at the same time to make quite ruthless choices about what we need to do now to deal with climate. And if we try and save everything and everyone and just continually give, there's just not enough resources in the planet so that everyone else comes in, including nature. Willow, your thoughts either on Gabrielle's views, or do you have a sort of idea of what women's leadership looks like to you that you can share with us?
Such a potent question. And I can't speak for other women, but I would say there are things that may be emerging that could be traits. But I actually think, Gabrielle, to what you said about the fossil fuel companies are most fearful of mothers protecting their children, like, hold on a second, that's a huge majority of the world. And the role here of us as women together, I think there's something more actually about collective leadership and collective governance and shared governance, and shared leadership. Like I think there's something around shifting from the kind of hero mentality. If we think about the time we're in now, and at the moment particularly, we're in the great transition, the great turning, whatever is the terminology that we're drawn to in trying to articulate what this time is. And what that means to us in that shift also, as we're starting to unlearn a lot of inherited mechanistic mindsets that we've been taught that this is how the world works. And you can even look at like history is his story. Who's told history? What about her story? What about their story? Like there's all these, sorry, I'm getting tripped up on different language, but I think there's different ways to be thinking about everything when we listen more deeply. And if that's leadership, then we all are, because we're all with our communities and our people and our families and our friends listening and trying to help us, be together and be who we are together. So what I'm in I can only speak for my personal learning journey as a leader. So I can't speak for others. I don't know if there's any one way. I don't think there should ever be one way. But I am learning, or at least attempting to try and better practice how to be a facilitative leader, which is knowing when I need to get out of the way and trying to help people shine and do their best work so that I can help it come forth. So that's probably going to take a while to say that I kind of got this, but I'm just sort of only learning about the term at the moment, going, this feels like how to be useful is actually to help open up people to do their best work. And it's really also around how to step out of the roles we thought we were meant to have in our jobs and into our roles as humans, which is a different thing between a role and a job. The role you play in community as we look at building next economy work and caring economies and sharing economies is so undervalued at the moment, and we're trying to retell that story. So I'm speaking around a whole lot of different things, but it's like there's the narratives, there's the words and the language and the jargon, which I'm sorry people have said I'm good at. So apologies for just dropping in a whole lot of words. But I think women's leadership. Yeah, I don't know. Let's find out. I think it's about listening together and being together and trying to do the work and just dropping the ego and the BS out the door and just getting on with what needs to be done.
Thanks, Willow. And we've got some questions or some comments coming in. And one is from Dr. Lorraine Larry, Darua, or on Darua land, if I've got that right, sorry. And it's really about this concept of unlearning. It's something that's resonating for me as well, is how much unlearning I've had to do and how much my language has been captured by us.
In there, as long as you promise not to spill anything.
Sorry, we've, if you're not, had some just background noise come in, so.
I think it's muted.
I think they've muted now. Yeah.
Muted now, so. Tell us a little bit more about unlearning, Willow, as a concept, and how can we all be unlearning things that no longer serve us?
Goodness. Well, I suppose, okay, here's an idea. If we might just spend 30 seconds together imagining a grapefruit-sized shape, and that grapefruit actually lives inside your gut, right down here, inside both the center and the center of us. And that grapefruit is our gut and our instinct. And if you remember, when we remember to come into our center and come into our gut, our nervous systems know what is right and wrong and how we actually feel. And we can, it's a power. And it's very easy to get very heady and out of body and out of being state and into kind of like, oh, and the distraction economy and all of the other things. So I suppose, and I was very good as a younger person at ignoring it too and making some spectacularly bad decisions along the way, right? So coming back to that, I think, has been really fundamental, to kind of listen to my instinct. And part of that is letting go, confronting uncomfortable things about myself or how I'm perceiving others, and where is that coming from? What are the source of those perceptions and assumptions? And it's an ongoing process, I suppose. I sort of like think of like almost like an onion skin. It's about peeling layers back to reveal who we are in our essence. And that is also about stepping into our role and our through great privilege, our destiny to be good ancestors, right? So letting go, shedding, unlearning. I think maybe I've heard, I can't remember who, but perhaps, no, I don't remember who said it, but it's actually more about relearning. So to remember who we really are. And when we center and work from instinct and with respect and with sort of right scaled responsibility, I think then we can come back to the sort of essence of who we are as humans and the roles we want to play in the world.
Gabrielle, any thoughts on unlearning or relearning or remembering?
I think that's a not something. Can I tackle? I was all prepared to tackle the question about Tanya Plumset. Can I take that one?
You can indeed.
Yes. Okay. I'll come back to you on the unlearning.
Yeah, there's a question for those that haven't read it of why is Tanya still a new gas and oil?
So I'll give two answers to that question. The first one is your traditional like policy advisor's answer to that question, which would be Tanya, as Minister for the Environment's responsibility is to implement the EPBC Act, which stands for the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, which is the Commonwealth Act, which has a number of criteria for federal government intervention on the approval of large projects. That does not include emissions or climate at this point. There has been much campaigning for probably about the last decade for a climate trigger to be included in that bill, but that has not happened at this point. So she does not actually have legislation that she's responsible for that allows her to change her decision for approvals on the basis of the greenhouse gas emissions associated with that project at this point in time. So that's a straight, what does the legislation say, and therefore what can the minister do? Obviously, there is some discretion, and there would be ways of not approving projects on all of the other grounds under the Act, that's biodiversity or national heritage and the like. The power analysis answer it goes to the issue of state capture that I mentioned. So Richard Dennis likes to say that Australia is a very friendly petrostate. I think he's half right. I don't think Australia as a whole, particularly in the national government, is a petro state, but I think Western Australia and the Northern Territory, and to a significant extent South Australia because of Santos, are very much petro states. And unfortunately, for example, so lots of people on this call probably know, the Northern Territory currently has a female Labor Chief Minister who has said that the only way in which the Northern Territory can develop and pay its debts is an expansion of the gas industry in that territory, which is utterly and totally appalling. But that shows you why I like to think of the fossil fuel industry as a collection of evil cabals, because they do, in fact, capture people and capture their thinking. And to give you an extent to which these industries and industry organisations go to, they identify people in young Labor and young Liberals, and they will give them tickets to the cricket or the Santos Tour Down Under or any like sporting event that's sponsored by the fossil fuel industry. And they will be cultivating those people from age 19 onwards. And, you know, some of them will end up, you know, in Parliament, some of them will end up as ministers. And so those people are, you know, they know people who work for fossil fuel companies personally. When the Labor state government, the newest one, got elected in South Australia, who did Santos hire as their new head of government affairs? The Labor Premier's brother. So, you know, when I said these people are really, really good at what they do, it's to that extent. And that's why I think it really needs to be, you know, the only force that can sort of take that on is parents or mothers and grandmothers are the only ones that can counteract that sort of level of state capture. And particularly when you look at not only the risks to the climate as a whole, but there are also obviously significant environmental impacts for each of these fossil fuel projects, even if, you know, a lot of them are on Indigenous land and, you know, out of sight, out of mind for people that live in urban areas. And yeah, just really encourage everyone to recognise the insidious nature of those organisations and the influence that they have on our politics. And, you know, that's my explanation why we have a federal Labor government that's very good on domestic climate change policy, but we have a federal resources minister that the Sydney Morning Herald, and its estimable style, described as a refinery girl. And what was it a surprise that the federal resources minister grew up down the road from a refinery where her father, you know, worked and all the rest. So I think it's really important to recognise the extent to of the cultural, personal, economic hold that those fossil fuel cabals have on our politics in Australia.
So a follow-up question from Janet in the chat is, don't these fossil fuel executives see the danger for themselves, and don't they have children, and don't they watch the news like the rest of us, or are they lacking something or need to unlearn something perhaps to take action about the climate crisis?
I think that one of my favourite sayings, which comes up almost daily, is never underestimate the human capacity for denial. And, you know, if you have spent your whole life working in oil and gas companies or for coal companies, then, and everyone around you that you work with sees, you know, that the rationale is, you know, it's fossil fuels that have given us the quality of life that we have, which is in a large part true. and that to continue that quality of life, we need that to continue, and that we can't transition to renewables overnight, which is also true. And so they exist in denial, for which they are very highly paid and live very comfortable, reified lives if you're the CEO of a fossil fuel company. And so they're here for a good time, not a long time. And yeah.
Willow, any thoughts on why the cabal of entrenched or the fossil fuel cabal just don't get the need to change?
Yeah, and I don't know if I'm really radical or controversial or pragmatic here, but my curiosity of trying to understand the mess we're in, let's call it, has been around, you know, what is driving that, these decisions around, and how is power and decision making being made at the expense of so much for the benefit of so few, and actually what is behind power. And I think it could be fear, it could be you know, there's greed and there's hoarding and there's a whole lot of sort of old modes and ways of being that I just don't think are serving anyone anymore. And I think that fear and the fear of other, and I think also what happens with extreme wealth or even just certain amounts of wealth is that you're not touching the ground anymore. There's some disconnection then to who we are that can happen. I'm not saying everybody that's got a lot of money is like that, but we can sort of see that happening in our culture as well. And so it's I sort of then will be sitting around and going, well, what are people scared of? Is it being scared of death? Is it being scared of what I don't understand? And that there's this sort of the dark shadow side of who we are hidden in all of that. And I think we need a better game. I've just come across a really cool thing called Game B. I'll chuck it in the chat. It's quite awesome. And it's like saying that rather than this is how things are, this is how things were. We're just living through the dying vestiges of an old system that is no longer fit for purpose. And we have to help hospice it well, whilst we midwife the next system. And so as the cracks are appearing in our current existing systems, these cracks are letting light shine through. And we want to widen and deepen those cracks for more beautiful regenerative healing and repair and flourishing the world flourishing, our people, our communities, our ecologies, our grandchildren, our descendants yet to come can have a flourishing future through that. And so I think it's like trying to help say, well, okay, well, if that's what power and wealth supremacy, I know there's a book coming out by a woman from the Democracy Collaborative later in the year called Wealth Supremacy about this. It's like, what has happened? We have this sort of very, very sick system that's dying and in the last stages of the ends of capitalism, the death of old capitalism and what's going to come next. And to have an alternative to move towards, probably the world in even 5 to 10 years is going to be so, even 2 years is going to be so different to the world we know now. But it's up to us to help co-create what it can be through that. So that's a bit of an internal monologue. I don't know if that makes any sense, but I think there's a lot we can do. Even whilst despairing at the horror of it and thinking about how completely corrupt and unfair this existing dying system is, its time is done. Nobody wants it. Like, done. Let's help that go to bed and put it away back in the soil and get on with the work.
Yes, the word I like from the permaculture background is composting. So
yes, exactly.
But we had an interesting question earlier in the chat about artificial intelligence and some comments. It's sort of the new existential risk on the block, and it seems to be taking the oxygen out of the imperative to act on climate change. So I wonder your thoughts on, is it a distraction? Is it something that can help us, or is it part of the new or part of the old? So any thoughts on artificial intelligence and its emergence now?
Yeah, like all of this, it could be absolutely amazing. It could also be the end of us, and we don't know. But I think if we want to find out, and we would like it to be a tool that we can design with, an incredible technology that we can design with, we have to get in there and also face our fears, because there's a lot of dystopian stories out there and they're terrifying because that's all possibilities. But there's a lot of protopian emerging ideas of how we could actually design with AI. And I'm only coming around to this myself recently. I was like, no, man, I'm not going near that. That is just absolutely terrifying. And I'm sort of going, listening to some other people talk about it, going, well, what if we were to actually consider AI as another form of consciousness that is yet to, have a full sentient birthing, but it's on its way and it will probably happen really fast. What if we work with it and make friends with it? And that would then be everyone suddenly got a whole lot broader. It could be our greatest gift, and it could be the end of us. And we don't know yet, but I'm up for trying to co-design with it and see what we can do.
Thank you, Gabrielle.
I know we're short on time, so I'll just say, look, because I've been doing climate for 30 years, there have been a lot of distractions over that time. And, we still haven't got to grips with it. I think, especially what we've seen in the last few weeks and months, is that events are totally going to overtake us, regardless of the distractions. When 40% of the population of the United States last week were under a heat warning, it's all happening far faster than anyone predicted. So it was really good comment about we need to be planning for adaptation as well as mitigation. We do need to do both. And I think that the level of people don't understand that it's not just the weather. When I was involved with the Labour Environment Action Network, we got T-shirts printed with a graphic of a polar bear, and the T-shirt said, "It's not just about the polar bears anymore." Every aspect of human life, through destructions of the food chains. I was listening to a terrible podcast in the sense that it was American woman talking about how American kids won't be able to go to summer camp outdoors and walk in the woods anymore because it's too hot. And they're talking about putting in, taking over old department stores and turning them into indoor climbing gyms and art spaces and stuff so that the kids can go to summer camp indoors. We know that our kids won't be able to play sport because the grounds will be too hard and all the rest. We know that we'll have, not only increases of various vector-borne diseases and a whole lot of health consequences, but, in the rich world, it will be all of this discomfort and annoyance and frustration and all the rest. Meanwhile, as my favourite quote on climate change says, the poor will die. That's like, once you've described the discomfort in the wealthy world, our world will be sort of more grey and colourless, but we will be looking at, millions of people dying all around the world, but particularly obviously in the most vulnerable countries. And then we will be looking at millions of those people being on the move. We've got Indonesia to the north of us. Most of those people live less than a metre above sea level. They're going to want to move to high ground. They're going to want to come here. And Cheryl knows all about the geopolitical implications of climate and all of this. Events are going to far overtake, whatever the other random distractions of the moment are. So I better stop because I see it's 7:01.
So thank you both. We have run out of questions. I could probably continue this conversation for a lot longer, but we have reached our time. And I know some have food, dinners, children, cats tennis and other things to get to. So I'd just like to everyone join in and thank Gabrielle and Willow for such great content. So it's a very rich session. I know I'm going to be reflecting some of this for a while after. So thank you both. And I'm just going to, as we take ourselves out, just with one word only, what calls you to action? So Gabrielle, you're on at the moment.
I'm going to give you one word, which is courage, but I'm going to give you a reason. And that's that I read this recently and I was like, this is the best thing for climate. Courage is more important than hope.
So thank you. Courage. Willow?
That's so lucky I didn't go with hope because I was about to, and then I was actually no. It's actually potential.
Potential. So there's two, courage and potential, two great words to take us out. And thanks everyone for staying with us a little bit over the time, but we'll have to say thank you and farewell now. So thanks everyone.
Thank you. I might just quickly jump in to say that first of all, to thank Cheryl very much for her wonderful moderating of that conversation, and Gabrielle and Willow, of course. Thank you. And just to say, we will be back again at the end of August with another conversation. And I'm at the moment talking to our sister organisation, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, who have been negotiating to get demilitarisation included on the negotiating agenda for COP28. And hopefully one of our international colleagues from WILF will be here with some others to speak about that. So thank you, everyone, and good night.